Welcome to Know What I Mean. My name's George.
My name's Oscar. In this week's episode, we talk about our two very different interpretations of this quote, the path of least resistance and the value of solving problems on your own.
Let's get into the episode expediently. So today's quote is, "There is no expedient to which man will not resort to evade the real labour of thinking," by Sir Joshua Reynolds. My first impressions when I read this quote was that I thought it just meant people will do anything to avoid thinking. And I didn't really agree with that because I thought, well, I really enjoy thinking and I'm not trying to do all the different things I can to avoid thinking. Part of the reason of choosing this quote was that it was something that didn't quite make sense with me when I was first reading it. And I thought it'd be interesting to really dig in and try and understand it. So the first half of the quote is, "There is no expedient to which man will not resort." And I decided to look up expedient, and the definition of that is something that's convenient and practical, although possibly improper or immoral. So this is something that's kind of a bit of a painful truth, really, to think that people will do whatever is convenient and practical to them, no matter what, basically. That's kind of what it seems to be saying. And I was thinking about this, and there are so many times in life where people will just do the easy thing, and that kind of is the default, to just take the path of least resistance, whatever's going to get you to your goal quickest, or just going to make things as simple as possible. That's the thing that people go for. So the expediency is kind of the default of humans, really. The default is to do the easiest thing that doesn't require any extra thought. And then I looked at the second half of the sentence, which is about the real labor of thinking. And thinking really is a labor. Chess players, when they're having a tournament day, they can burn up to 6,000 calories a day. The average person burns around 2,000 calories. So that's an insane increase in how much they're burning. And the reason for that is that they're constantly being trapped by their opponent. Their opponent is trying to get them to do what's most expedient, basically. They're trying to, set something up so that the other player goes, okay, well, I'll just do this, or I'll just do this. But as a chess player, they've got to constantly think and not do the thing that's the easiest or most simple or has the least resistance. So it's something that's incredibly intensive and burns a lot of energy to not do the most expedient thing. That's kind of why we've evolved this tendency to do what's expedient, because it's much easier to just do the simple thing that's in front of us that doesn't burn any energy, that fits in with all the other patterns that we've seen, because so much of evolution is about conserving energy and not using more resources than we need. So I've kind of revised the quote, what I think of it now, after researching a bit more and trying to really dig into it. So the revised quote is, "To avoid using their willpower, people are capable of doing anything, however bad, as long as it is convenient and practical for them to do so." Obviously, that's kind of a bit of a change from the original quote, but I'd be interesting to see what you think of that definition, or what you thought of the quote.
Well, I guess with that definition you've just said, it, for me, it feels like that broadens it out potentially further than it was initially intended. It would be really cool to have this person here to actually ask them, because I think it's interesting that we've interpreted it differently.
Yeah.
My impression from what you said there was that labor of thinking almost translates to, actually, I won't home in on just labor of thinking, but while I think that thinking is specified in this quote, it seems that the definition that you've taken doesn't include it so much, in that we take I'm kind of curious about how would you define labor of thinking in this case? How would that translate in your version of it?
It's basically diverting from what is expedient. Say the default is in every moment of your life, the natural thing that you're going to do is just whatever's most expedient. But sometimes in order to not do that, to live up to certain principles you may have, or to change patterns or do things that might have long-term benefits, you need to think, because just doing what's expedient is kind of like being lost in reaction to your environment, not taking a step back to actually consider your actions. It's about just taking the easiest action. So that's how I see the thinking part is deciding what action to take rather than just doing option A every time.
Okay. Yeah, I get that. So say if you've got like a negative habit, then you're not actually having to think about it at that point. It's just the way the stream's going and you just go with it. Yeah. Whereas this is saying that there's two options. One, which requires very little thought. It just requires you just going to the fridge and just picking something out and eating it. Like it's not, you don't have to put any thought into it. And the other option is that you're actually considering your actions. You're actually considering what you're doing. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. A way I kind of think of it is, say you're on a train track and they're all set to go in a certain direction. And the labor of thinking is actually going, oh, okay, actually, I want to change that track ahead to another course. But it's like there's a default course set for you. And the labor of thinking is, rather than always choosing option A, it's let me analyze B, C, and D, and then see which one's best.
Okay, cool. Well, it fits in nicely to the first thing that came to mind it was the second thing that came to mind when I read this quote, actually. I do graphic design, and once a week I help out with keeping work resources up to date. I really struggle with this particular job because it requires a lot of different bits of knowledge to do it. And I put myself in a victim position with it, of that potentially through a lack of training or the fact that my particular department doesn't cover what we cover in this weekly task that I get set. I've just excused myself from having to think about it properly, from having to actually deal with the task that's in front of me. So how that actually looks is I get set a task. I feel like I don't know how to do this. I shouldn't know how to do this because this isn't anything like the other kind of work that I do. So as soon as I have that feeling, then I go to this guy at work, and I feel bad for him because I always ask so many questions about things. And I think asking questions is great, but what's happening here is that I'm literally doing what I think this quote is talking about, which is that instead of actually trying to tackle this issue that I'm having myself, I'm just going with the absolute easiest option, which is just reaching out and asking someone else to take responsibility for it, essentially. So if I ask someone if they can help me, then I distribute that responsibility and I give it to them. So it's just like, I don't know. Do you know? As soon as that happens, then it's like the ball's in their court, essentially, and I can just take it off myself. I just realized that quite often I'd ask questions and then someone wouldn't get back to me immediately, for example, and then I'd actually work out how to do it very quickly afterwards. I was like, I have to get this done. And then I just figure out how to do it. Yeah. And so a couple of weeks ago, I was just like, when this urge comes up to just ask, I'm just going to pause and try and do it myself. And it's been so good. My confidence has gone up so much because I'm actually much more capable than I was giving myself credit for. It's been interesting to notice in myself where that urge comes from to reach out in that way. And I think it is just a lack of confidence and wanting to give someone else the responsibility for things and therefore avoid the labor of thinking. Yeah. So it actually feels very current for me.
That's such a cool example, man, because you had that option on the table of basically someone will solve it for you. Then you just go, well, obviously you would do that. I used to do a similar thing with when I was in the kitchen with my mum. Anything, any food, any utensils, anything, I would always ask my mum where it was, when I use that kitchen just as much as she did by this point. So there's no reason she should know any more than I do about that sort of thing. But it was just a habit from being a child. You know, rather than thinking, where would this thing be? I would always just default to like, Mum, where's this? Mum, where's that? And that's the thing. If it's on your list of options, if your option A is just ask someone to where something is or how to do it, then you always resort to that first rather than finding out a solution. But like what you've done now is now you've got option A is try to solve it myself. And then option B is ask someone else for help on it.
Yeah. It's so weird how small a decision that is to just pause for a second and how much difference it's actually made. It's been quite revolutionary in the way that I've been working. It's actually been really cool. So it's funny that you'd pick this quote, which feels really appropriate to that. I said earlier that the thing that I've just talked about was the second thing that I thought of. The first thing was that I actually Googled this quote and how other people would how other people would thought of it previously. So that was quite ironic. I don't think I've I don't think I've actually done that with the quote before, but I was like, I think the word expedient, it just sounds like quite intellectual or I don't know, highbrow or something like that. So I was just like, nope, I'm not capable of understanding what this means.
Yeah.
Let's go on Google. So that was quite ironic that happened.
I think one thing that's, because this can feel a bit like a negative thing of like, oh, people always just do whatever's easiest for them. But I think it is really important to remember that that is a good thing in general. Like that's been really helpful throughout our evolution. And in a lot of cases, it's best to do what's easiest. Like if you want to find out a problem, you can, Google it or something like that. Like there's lots of times where it's really good that we have this thing where we can just do whatever's easiest for us without thinking. It is a useful thing, but there's times where we need to think about it and maybe rearrange our priorities. And I thought there's two key ways that you can deal with this fact of how humans are drawn towards doing whatever is most expedient. So imagine I'm in bed, the alarm's just gone off, and kind of the first stage is snoozing and getting annoyed because you've just stayed in bed, because that's what's easiest. Like you've got everything in your body is like, no, just relax, stay in bed, it's fine. There's no immediate threat, just relax, rest. So you just stay in bed. And that is just doing what is most expedient in that moment. Then the second one is kind of realizing, okay, I will just do whatever's easiest for me. So I'm going to fight that. I'm going to use my willpower. I'm going to force myself to get out of bed. So your alarm goes off and you're like, right, you little bitch, we're getting out of bed. Like just doing like whatever you can to like talk yourself into it and brute force your way into doing something that isn't the most easy, natural thing to do. And there are plenty of times in life where you do need to have that kind of brute force, but there's a lot of times when you can do something like what you did by changing your priorities and just taking that pause to try and solve the problem on your own. And in the case of the alarm clock, the thing that I discovered is if I just put my alarm somewhere where I can't reach it from my bed, then that helps so much, because I have to physically get out of bed, turn off the alarm, and then, I'm already up. I've already done the hard part. So that was something I was doing when I had a trouble getting out of bed in the mornings. I just put my phone somewhere that I had to get out of bed, and then, also told myself, once I'm out of bed, I can't go back into bed. I need to go straight to have a shower. And by doing that, that helped so much. So rather than fighting against this force within yourself, it's great to actually use it, like judo or jiu-jitsu or something. You're using the force of this to set up your environment. So actually doing the thing that's best for you is the most expedient thing, and really aligning those things together. So seeing how can you you change your priorities, or even things like changing the layout of your house, or I don't know, if you always lose your keys, having like a bowl where you always put your keys when you get home. There's loads of different things that you can do to make it so that it's easier to do the thing that's best for you. And that's something that an idea I've kind of thought about for quite a while and played with in different areas of my life, kind of changing the environment. So the natural and easy thing is also the moral thing. And because you're going to do what's easy if it's moral or amoral. That's kind of what this quote is saying. So it's up to you really to choose in those moments of thinking, to choose how to set up your life so that it's easier to do the right thing in situations.
And I guess in that way, you're not having to engage with the labor of thinking, but you are still doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because there's only, like I was saying, it uses a lot of calories and a lot of energy. And even though that's not so much a concern for most people nowadays, it's still, people say you've only got a limited amount of willpower in the day. Like you can't spend your entire day grinding and going against human nature. It's just it's just not going to end very well. So it's still great to use those moments of thinking and deciding to break a habit or not go with the easiest thing. However, those are precious. Those are kind of moments of grace in a way, when you're able to do something other than what everything is leading you towards. Like that is a real moment of grace, and something that you can have multiple times a day in smaller ways, or, fairly rarely in large ways. So it's something to really cherish and make the most of. And it's good to make it so that the majority of the things that you do, you make them as easy as possible for you to do.
Yeah. And I guess that links into why we love an underdog and why we love people that seem to, against all odds, make it through something. Everything is pointing towards the fact that they're not going to succeed in this thing, and yet they do. There's something within us that's like really inspired by that because of the level of willpower and the level of effort that would actually require. When I was thinking about this quote, I hadn't gone into the depth that you've gone into in terms of, well, I guess I feel like I just took it more, just skimmed over it as a quote and then thought, okay, so this is about thinking, and it's about the effort of thinking, and that people basically want to avoid thinking. My sense was that there was an air, as you mentioned in the beginning, of judgment around this, that people just can't be bothered to think. Plato was really against the new technology of writing things down, of people being literate and actually just writing down information, because that would lead to laziness. That would lead to people not having to remember. I just found that really interesting, that there's these new technologies that come along that it makes it easier for us to not have to think. It makes it easier to just get things down and just clear our minds and not have to consider things. And that there is always a resistance to those sorts of technology. And there's always a bit of a snobbishness around those technologies too, which I guess I got a little bit from this quote. And I just found it really interesting that Plato thought that about writing things down. He actually said, they will cease to exercise memory because they rely on that which is written, calling things to remembrance no longer from within themselves, but by means of external marks. And I just found it really funny that he was just like super against writing stuff down. Yeah. I guess because it doesn't require the labor of thinking and his love of thinking, maybe.
Yeah. I see it as kind of outsourcing a function that used to be served by the brain, which of remembering things. You're now outsourcing some of that externally outside of your being onto paper. And it's the same thing with Google. People say like, oh, well, you don't need to learn anything now because you can just find it out with Google. So there's no point knowing facts or knowing any things like that, because if you want to find out, you can just find out. And it's an amazing resource to be able to do that. But there's a big problem with that, with storing all of the knowledge outside of your brain and kind of just searching for it like that when you need it. Because in order to have fresh ideas and innovative ideas, you need synthesis of ideas. You need to have these ideas contained within your own psyche in order for them to interact with each other and for you to come up with novel solutions to them. You need those ideas inside of you for them to react and change and interact with each other and then be expressed. Warren Buffett, for example, who is one of the richest people in the world, I think one of the most successful investors. And he constantly is reading about these different companies, trying to understand the CEOs and just having a deep understanding of the lay of the land, of all of the different people, how this company is run, every single piece of information. And that's how he can make a good decision, is because he can synthesize all that information within himself. It's not enough to be able to like, oh, well, I've got all the information on the company I need. I can search for the number of employees by doing this. I can search for this by doing this. And I think that can really lead to kind of an impoverished mindset where you feel like, oh, it's fine because I've got all the information, but you're really not utilizing some of the most incredible parts of being a human, of how your unconscious mind can combine information and cross-reference things all in the background whilst you're doing other stuff. And if you don't have the raw data contained inside of yourself, then that's just not possible.
Well, I have a load of stuff on disagreeing with this quote as well. The easiest way of me showing how I disagree is just reading a slightly altered version of this quote. So there is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the labor of not thinking. I guess this is coming from the perspective of that thinking is a compulsive, addictive thing that we do and everyone does all the time. I don't want to paint it badly. It's just like part of the nature of the mind, but it's completely incessant and it is completely addictive. It shapes our entire world. And I was listening to a podcast today, 10% Happier by not Sam Harris, the other Dan Harris. Sorry, Dan. Everyone does that, I'm sure. Yeah, and it was talking about thoughts in relation to self and how we are terrified of the cessation of thought because it's how we keep our whole sense of identity and our world alive. So from the perspective of that, thought is pretty involuntary. It is just, it's a huge identity project that's going on all the time that we're using, and not only an identity project, but literally like a world creating project of propping up our sense of us being the center of things by constantly thinking about our relativity to other things, our idea of ourselves in relation to the world. And yeah, I guess that was a bit of another angle on this quote is just that actually there's no labor in thinking. Thinking is totally involuntary and compulsive, and it just is happening for everyone all the time. I think that one perspective on this quote could be that there's an assumption in it that, say, people who are quite erratic or like confused or difficult, that they are thoughtless or mindless, or they're not actually thinking things through properly. But I would just say that that's completely wrong. You know, it's actually that the thoughts themselves can be less coherent and can seem to connect together in a way that doesn't make sense to me or you. But there's an equal amount of thought for everyone all the time. It's a constant stream, basically. It's like a never-ending stream of thought. And I wonder, just looking at this quote, if there is potentially in here a bit of a snobbery thing of the upper educated class. I think I'm a thoughtful person. I really consider life and I think about life. And all these other people are kind of mindlessly just going through life, blindly kind of bumping into things. And they're not really thinking. They're not thinking things properly. I would question that. I'd say there's definitely differences in the quality of thought or quality of coherence and stuff, but that we are actually thinking all the time. So in terms of this actual fear of the cessation of thought, of the stopping of thought, this really relates a lot to meditation. In meditation, I found that, say if you're doing really simple breathing meditation, you're just literally focusing on the breath, and as you're concentrating and becoming more absorbed in what you're doing, the mind naturally starts to quieten. Since your focus becomes so single pointed, other things seem to die down. And I found really, it's funny how much I avoid getting into that depth. It seems very counterintuitive. It's like I sit down to meditate, and obviously I want to feel peaceful and I want to get as concentrated as possible, depending on what kind of meditation I'm doing. But if I'm doing a concentration meditation practice, then you'd assume that that's what I want. But it isn't a lot of the time, because my usual comfortable realm of existence is basically made up by my thoughts about things, of what I'm going to be doing later that day, what I think about myself and other people, etc. So having that die down leads to this really amazing, mysterious, but also quite daunting space, because your whole world dies down with it. And that's been my experiences. Sometimes I've got into really deep states, and actually it's sort of like plunging and diving down into water, and at a certain point the pressure just becomes a little bit too much, and you start to panic a bit because it's so quiet that you need to rush up to the top to what's familiar again. And I've had that experience quite a few times in different forms through doing inquiry practice as well, like inquiring into my sense of identity and things like that. You can end up ending up a bit too deep and like, whoa, and then like really wanting to retract back again. In the opposite version of the quote, there is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the labor of not thinking. It's like thinking constantly, that keeps everything intact. Even if it's quite uncomfortable, even if they're suffering, at least it's familiar. When we are not thinking, that's when things really start to go weird, but in quite an amazing way. And there's so much potential there, but it's also quite scary.
Yeah. And I think that can even fit into the other definition of the quote, the idea of, being still, and the fact that that is a very different from what you feel like doing, the addiction of compulsive thinking and always needing to have a story going on about who you are, what you need to do, what people you owe favors to, what people owe favors to you, all of these different things that kind of keep you feeling sane, in a way of feeling like you know what's going on and what should happen in the future and what's happened in the past. So that is kind of the most expedient thing, is just to stay in that world that's kind of, more solid. And the hard thing to do in that case is not thinking, basically breaking that pattern. But yeah, I think that's really interesting, just flipping it on its head. And that's kind of part of why I was excited about this quote, was because I thought it was not super clear from the start, and there was like some weird bits in it that I didn't quite agree with. And I was really interested to see how we would bring in different ideas and how we would have different interpretations of it. And that's the thing that I've been really enjoying about this podcast, is we kind of have the quote as a starting point, but it can lead to all sorts of different places.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. And I've definitely found exploring this, it's not super easy. I think there's a lot of little snags and things you have to think more about. You have to try and bend your mind a bit and try and see it from like a few different angles. And I didn't find it easy to write notes for. But yeah, it's been really good just trying to figure our way through it, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's been fun. All right, that seems like a logical place to end it.
Yes, I think so.
Although that would be expedient, wouldn't it? Let's go on for another fucking 2 hours. I'll tell you one thing that's very expedient of me.
Okay, go on then.
Is how we've kind of got a structure for the end of the podcast that you've written down. And because you have it written down, my brain has made zero effort to remember it myself. And I ask you every single week. So what's the order of this?
Yeah.
because it's being
Can you
stored
work it out?
outside of me.
While I'm looking it up,
All right,
can you
let's do it.
actually?
All right, before Oscar reads out the quote for next week, thanks for listening, guys. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you've got any... What was it? What the fuck do we say? Jesus. No, don't tell
Subscribe.
me. Just subscribe, tell
Should I
your
tell you?
mates, and donate. All right, I got it.
Yeah.
All right.
Keep saying all right.
And wherever you guys are listening, if you want to subscribe, that would be awesome. If this episode made you think of anyone that you think would enjoy it, then please spread the love and share it with them. And if you want to buy us a coffee to help support the podcast, then we'll leave the link down in the description.
Yes. So the quote for nailed it. The quote for next week is by Virginia Woolf. You cannot find peace by avoiding life. It's a pretty straight. It's not a simple one, but it's a short one. It's quite a short one.
That's nice.
If you've got any ideas about this quote and want to let us know, then you can visit our Instagram, which is knowwhatimean.podcast, and just tell us what you're thinking of the podcast. And it'd be lovely to hear from you.
Awesome. Have a good week, guys. Peace.
Yeah, catch you next week.